SMiLE is the name of the new Beach Boys album, which will be released in January 1967. And with a happy album cover, the really happy sounds inside, and a happy in-store display piece, you can't miss. We're sure to sell 1 million units in January.
Throughout the history of music, there has been many works that remained unfinished by composers, such as Mozart's Requiem, Schubert's Symphony No. 8, unfinished, and in 1967, perhaps the most unfinished piece of music of the 20th century is the Beach Boys' SMiLE. Now, you could say SMiLE was finished when Brian Wilson released Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE in 2004, but I think it's safe to say that the SMiLE we would have got in 1967 would not have been the SMiLE we got in 2004. What we are left with is some of the most beautiful and unique music ever released by the Beach Boys, so let's dive into this unfinished masterpiece. There's a lot of information about SMiLE, and it can be quite difficult to decipher what's real and what's not because there's a lot of mythos within SMiLE. And Brian has said things that has contradicted himself, whether he said them on purpose or not, we don't know. Like on the biography channel, Brian Wilson documentary.
It'll never come out. It's just the tapes have been destroyed.
But I think that's just Brian's way of he didn't want to talk about it, That's basically it, what I think. And I've done a lot of research, and even all the books I've read and things I've watched, there's even contradictions between them. So there's contradictions between different books and different documentaries and different things people have said online. So that's just kind of the nature of SMiLE in a lot of ways. It has that mythos of it, of you're trying to figure it out, even the history of it, even though there's certain things, obviously, that are true, that we know are true. But I think when you get down into the kind of weeds of it, it can start to get into more opinions rather than facts. So, but that's just the nature of SMiLE. I think it makes it even more interesting. I'm not going to go into music theory much in the video because that would take me forever. I would be into so much songs. But there's a guy named Tim Smolens who does these really great videos on YouTube where he breaks down tracks. Mostly he does a lot of Beach Boys stuff. And he talks about the theory within the tracks. And you should really check them out because he does a great job on them. And I'll put a link to his channel below. Also, there's some books and documentaries that I got information from. So they'll be flashing over your screen now that I think you should check them out. And at the end, like I do with all these videos, is I recreate a section of one of the songs. People always say, why don't you do the full song? It's well, it's YouTube, all that, copyright stuff. It just gets messy. So doing a little piece is kind of cool. Short and sweet, In October 1966, the Beach Boys had just released their biggest single to date, Good Vibrations. Not only was it a commercial success, but it showcased Brian Wilson's ever-expanding production and compositional talents. Like Brian had done previously on Pet Sounds, by enlisting a collaborator outside the Beach Boys ecosystem in Tony Asher, his SMiLE collaborator would be vandykeparks. vandykeparks was no stranger to the limelight. He was a child actor starring alongside Grace Kelly in The Swan. He was and still is a fantastic composer and arranger. He would go on to release the excellent album Song Cycle in 1967, but that's a video for another time, one which I shall get down to at some point, I'm sure. Before working with Brian, Van Dyke worked with many artists including Tim Buckley, Judy Collins and The Byrds. He was asked to become a member of The Byrds, but he declined the offer.
I believe I could have been a bird. I tell myself that when I'm alone. I tell myself that David actually asked me to be in The Byrds. I could have been in all the blinking lights, but I didn't think that was cool, the blinking lights, the screaming girls, the page boy haircuts. I really wanted to be off camera as much as I do now.
Van Dyke and Brian first met when David Crosby invited Van Dyke to one of the Sloop John B sessions. Van Dyke said, I don't even think he had the voices on it yet, but I heard that long rotational breathing, that long flute at the beginning. I knew that this man was a great musician. Several months after their first meeting, Brian and Van Dyke met once again at Terry Melcher's place. It was out of this meeting that would grow the foundation for their collaboration on SMiLE. Van Dyke attended some Good Vibration sessions. As vandykeparks said, it was his idea to add the cello on Good Vibrations.
And I think the reason that I got the job with Brian Wilson was that I had been playing as a musician in Brian's works in the studio. And there came a time to arrange Good Vibrations, to get it done so that I could get more involved, because I wasn't really involved with Good Vibrations. I had been on the floor in the middle of Good Vibrations on a pedal, holding the pedals down with my hands, because it was easier to manipulate the foot pedals with my hands than with my stocking feet. In the middle of Good Vibrations, you'll hear a very low organ sustain pedal tone. That's me on the floor. Then I suggested the cello to Brian, because I wanted to see if I could get involved with a little more fancy music. We're going to get fancy here. We're going to get some strings in here and that aren't in the group that he's working with. And I was less mindful of the Beach Boys, so was interested in Brian Wilson's development and my own. So why don't we try a cello? So he says, great. I get to the studio and there's a cellist and there's a music stand, and his name was Jesse Ehrlich. And he was sitting there with no music on the music stand and rather perplexed. And I was in the control room with Brian Wilson, and I had assumed that Brian was going to write some notes for him. Those notes weren't there. So we went to the chorus, and I said to Brian, have him play eighth note triplets, secco, dry as a bone, the fundamental of the chord, eighth note, da 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 da, and as a result, got the Ruby Slippers moment of the song. I did that by my power of observation. I was there, lucky enough to be in the room with this gent, and I said, Arco. Brian went on talkback. He said, Jesse, Van Dyke says Barco. Jesse looked at Brian through the control room window and he said, Barco? I said, tell him with a bow, Brian. So, Arco, it was.
Van Dyke declined Brian's proposal to complete unfinished lyrics for Good Vibrations, preferring a joint creative effort. Writing together at Brian's home, their collaboration terms included Wilson purchasing Parks a $5,000 Volvo to address his transportation needs. When it came time for writing material for SMiLE, Van Dyke would go up to Brian's house, Brian would be at the piano, and Van Dyke would sit beside him. Van Dyke said, when I was working with Brian, I was available to him 24 hours a day. Every time I went up to his house we worked, we always got something done. When we got together, it was, Your Honour, may I approach the bench? And he would say yes, and I would go over there and approach the bench, and I would sit next to him on the bench. And he loved that. Just great fraternity. It was wonderful. It was just great. A fair-minded guy, no nonsense. Top of the heap saying, come on in. At one point for a certain time, Van Dyke and his then-wife Dory Parks moved in with Brian and his wife Marilyn. Some of Brian's eccentric behaviour Van Dyke was not down with, like when Brian moved his piano into the sandbox. Van Dyke didn't like that the dog started shitting in the sandbox, which I think is hilarious, man. I think that's such a cool idea, to put a piano in a sandbox and you put your feet in it, and it is like being on the sand. It's cool, man. That's cool.
I said I want to feel like I was on the beach, riding on the beach. So we had a guy install about 10 feet by 10 feet sandbox.
Thank God I got there before the dogs did.
I was asked to go into the sandbox to work. I worked outside the sandbox. I just couldn't bring myself to sit on the sand with the dogs.
We sat barefooted, just like it gave us the feeling that we were on the beach.
Shut your eyes and you're feeling the sand. Then it made sense.
What really became the problems was the two dogs crapping in the sand.
And so what did you write in the sandbox?
We wrote Heroes and Villains, Cabin Essence, Surf's Up, and Wonderful in the sandbox.
It was a pretty good sandbox.
Yeah, it was a great sandbox, yeah.
For this video, we will follow the SMiLE sessions order for the record. Of course, not saying that that would have been the order for the record. It's kind of based on Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE. So we'll go with the SMiLE sessions. SMiLE opens with the beautiful Our Prayer, which showcases the Beach Boys' amazing harmonies. But it's not just the harmonies, it's the vibe. And Brian was able to create a vibe within his music, because it's not just the notes you play, It's equally as important the vibe you create and the atmosphere you create. And Our Prayer created that atmosphere for the first track of SMiLE. Our Prayer then segues into the non-Brian Wilson composition G before it reaches the first track that vandykeparks and Brian wrote together, Heroes and Villains. Heroes and Villains invokes the images and atmosphere of the Wild West. Brian had a talent at being able to instill such a vibe in his work. He was able to paint with his music and give you such a beautiful image of what he was trying to describe.
I would listen to the radio and I'd hear the lyrics. I think I want to create lyrics for Van Dyke that's a notch up, about a notch up from the other lyrics that I was hearing. A little more artistic and poetic.
What I remember is the first thing we did was Heroes and Villains.
Oh my God.
Whole bunch of notes.
In the key of C sharp.
That scared the hell out of me. I mean, just in terms of words, as I recall it, we got lucky, we got some wind at our back, we sat there one day, and we knocked it to the ground.
Brian told Van Dyke that he had thought of the Old West when conceiving the melody. With regards to the lyrics, Van Dyke was reminded of the Marty Robbins 1959 song El Paso, and immediately conceived the opening line, "I've been in this town so long that back in the city, I've been taken for lost and gone and unknown for a long, long time." There are conflicting reports regarding who came up with the title. Brian credits Van Dyke with naming the song, but Van Dyke denied this, saying that he wrote the lyrics around the title that Brian has suggested. Brian's then wife Marilyn said, "There are so many screwed up people in the music industry, the good guys and the bad guys. That's one thing Brian had in his mind when he did Heroes and Villains." Van Dyke said the lyrics were based on the early history of California, including references to the involvement of the Spanish and American Indians. In Van Dyke's recollection, all but one section of Heroes and Villains was written entirely in one writing session. Heroes and Villains is one of the most complex productions in the Beach Boys' career. There was so much music and different sections recorded for the song that it said that production costs for Heroes and Villains alone was $40,000. Brian was constantly adding more sections and putting together various mixes. On the 11th of May 1966, Brian went into Gold Star Studios and recorded an instrumental take of Heroes and Villains with a runtime of 2 minutes 45 seconds. According to music historian Keith Badman, the session was conducted as an experiment and was not a fully fledged recording. It was one of the many recordings of the songs that has since perished or presumed lost or missing. For Heroes and Villains, Brian, like he did on Good Vibrations and many other tracks, recorded in various studios such as Western, Gold Star, Columbia. He again used the Wrecking Crew as his session musicians like he'd done on the previous few Beach Boys albums. I think also Heroes and Villains shows where Brian was starting to get stuck in the SMiLE puzzle because he kept recording and kept recording. Like if you think about it, he started recording Heroes and Villains on May 11, 1966, and still in 1967 he was adding more parts to it. So he just got stuck in that maze that he seemed to not be able to finish it. He just kept adding more fragments and more bits and pieces. And like I'll talk at the end of the video, that's one of the reasons why I think SMiLE didn't get finished. Van Dyke would continue the lyrical theme of Indians in Do You Like Worms, or also referred to as Roll Plymouth Rock. Again with SMiLE, there's conflicting information of was it going to be called Do You Like Worms or not. Al Jardine said, "I kept yelling at people over a capital. There's not one goddamn lyric about worms on this track. It's called Roll Plymouth Rock. I defy you to find anything about worms on there, but they wanted to name it Do You Like Worms. I'm sure that there was a song that Brian and Van Dyke did do called Do You Like Worms that they didn't even play for us." But studio dialogue from the October 18 session 1966 contradicts what Al says, because you can clearly hear Brian saying, "Do you like worms?"
Do you like worms? But what's that? Boop, boop.
But for the sake of this video, we can say Do You Like Worms or Roll Plymouth Rock. According to Van Dyke, it's about bringing this Euro sensibility into the taming of the American continent from Plymouth Rock to Waikiki. The bicycle rider mentioned in the lyric is a reference to the bicycle rider playing cards printed by the United States Playing Card Company during the 19th century. Van Dyke said, "A lot of people misinterpreted that, but that's okay. It's okay not to be told what to think if you're the audience." Most of the instrumental backing for the track took place on October 18th, 1966 at Western Studios. There's a callback to Heroes and Villains via the Bicycle Rider section. I'm in Great Shape, which, like a later song on SMiLE, Vegetables, would allude to Brian's interests at the time with healthy living and eating. The core instrumental track for I'm in Great Shape was recorded on October 27th, 1966 at Western. On November 4th, Brian recorded a piano demonstration of Heroes and Villains that included I'm in Great Shape and Barnyard as sections of the song. Van Dyke and KHJ DJ Humble Harv Miller are also featured on this recording, the former providing animal sounds for Barnyard. But it does work well coming before the woodshop section. As a part of I'm in Great Shape, with the woodshop section tucked on to the end of a 2018 release of Child is the Father of the Man, but they just put it in as kind of a little Easter egg. 2 years after the SMiLE sessions had been released, in 2013, an acetate of an early mix of Heroes and Villains was discovered. It indicated that Brian had experimented with incorporating recorded sections of I'm in Great Shape into the projected Heroes and Villains single. In reference to I'm in Great Shape, vandykeparks said, "It's interesting how in the lyrics there was all of a sudden this turning to eggs and grits. It's because it had something to do with the thought of a barnyard, and that related to the place we were trying to come up with in Heroes and Villains. All those lyrics were visual efforts." The effect at the end is achieved using tape feedback, which most people don't have analog tape recorders, but you can use a plug-in to try and get that effect, and here is how I did it. There's a lot of humour in SMiLE, and Barnyard is one of those tracks that displays Brian's humour. It features Brian's friends and different band members making animal noises.
We just signed different animals. And of course the first fight would be, I want to be the wolf, I want to be, and then we would make animal noises.
In 1978, Brian spoke of a Barnyard suite, which, as he said, would have been 4 songs in 4 short pieces combined together, but we never finished that one. We got into something else. Barnyard was tracked on October 20th, 1966 at Western. Again, it's hard to know, was this originally going to be part of the Heroes and Villains suite, or would the song have been fleshed out? We can never know. But I think it's a cool little song. I like it. I dig it. On the 14th of November, Brian recorded My Only Sunshine, a medley of the standards The Old Master Painter and You Are My Sunshine. The renditions are relatively short because Brian said he couldn't remember the full song. During the recording, Brian remarked that the session players should play as though they are far away, as the lyrics suggest, reflective of the spiritual themes recurring throughout the SMiLE songs. The Old Master Painter is a song that evokes God in its lyrics. The master take for You Are My Sunshine was spliced out of the original reel so that Dennis Wilson could add a lead vocal. In 1968, a mono mixdown of the tape was created, but as of 2004, the original master had gone missing from the band's archives. Sessions for My Only Sunshine took place on the 14th of November 1966 and the 10th of February 1967.
This is Studio 3 at Western. This is where I recorded a lot of music. My drummer Hal Blaine was right over there on the left. Jamie Glory on baritone sax, Steve Douglas on tenor, and Jim Horn on tenor were right there. Carol Kay on electric bass here, Ray Paul on electric bass here, and Lyle Ritz on stand-up bass there. The keyboards, Don Randy and Larry Nectar were here, right there. And Julius Wechter was the percussionist. He played right there.
And where would the strings be?
The strings would be right over here. 4 violins, 4 violas, and 4 cellos would be right here. Here's where the engineer was. Chuck Brooks was here. I was here producing. And our friends, the visitors, would be down there in chairs. And we'd get it on.
The last song in the first movement of SMiLE is another centerpiece, Cabin Essence. Brian was such a master at painting beautiful pictures with his music. He had a great knack for choosing the right instruments to evoke the images that he wanted to represent within his music. It is also one of the many songs lyrically where vandykeparks' lyrics came into question by Mike Love. During the initial recording for the song in late 1966, Van Dyke was called into the studio to settle a dispute from Mike Love over the lyrics.
I told vandykeparks, I asked him actually, what does this passage of lyrics mean?
I said, quite frankly, I don't know.
He says, I haven't a clue. So to me, I'm thinking, well, logically, we have an audience. We have a song. We were trying to portray something. Don't you want to relate to that audience?
Hey, they don't mean a damn thing, but they create an image that I find appealing.
Although Van Dyke refused to say what the lyrics were about, Mike sang the lines despite his reservations. Van Dyke said that himself and Brian were attempting to write a song that would end on a freeze frame of the Union Pacific Railroad. He also said, the whole thing seems to be about taking of the territory. Folks sing a song of the Grange. Granges were collectives of farms that would pool their resources so they could set their own prices, so that they weren't competing so much with each other, but so they were finding a reasonable return for their endeavours. Of course, that's almost a thing of the past, with the family farm disappearing from the country now, and agribusinesses the way it is. But the Grange system was the backbone of the American farm, and we had to bring the Chinese into this equation because they were working on the railroad, and the prairie was absolutely dependent on the railroads. Instrumentally, the track uses more Americana-type instruments such as banjo, harmonica and dobro. Vocally, there is some wonderful vocal arrangements by Brian, almost chant-like in some places.
Who ran the iron horse? Who ran the iron horse? Who ran the iron horse? Who ran?
The song starts off in a rather chilled kind of manner until it erupts when the Who Ran the Iron Horse section comes in, and it really gives the sound of movement and expansion, but all the instruments around it, like the cello and the bass, the fuzz bass is amazing, add this movement to the song, which is said to evoke the sound of the workers assembling the train tracks. But it does have this really expansive sound. It's almost like you're kind of flying over something, if you get me. Cabin Essence, like many songs on SMiLE, is recorded in a modular fashion that Brian had started with on Good Vibrations. The instrumental tracking for the Home on the Range section was recorded on October 3rd, 1966 at Gold Star Studios. A vocal and instrumental section for the Home on the Range section was taped on October 11th at Western Studio. Carl also overdubbed guitar on this session. The next day, on October 12th, Brian produced the Grand Coulee Dam section at Columbia Studio. Brian said, "The night I cut the instrumental part of Cabin Essence, no one could believe that a waltz could rock that hard. I had the 6-string bass player play electric fuzz tones. This got it going good. I was sure that I had recorded the most rockin' waltz ever recorded." On October 6th, further vocal overdubs were tracked at Columbia for Cabin Essence, a session that included the recording of Mike Love singing the Grand Coulee section. Structurally, it's quite simple. It's basically verse, chorus, verse, and then outro. But within the simple structure, Brian did some interesting things, like there's a nice modulation from E flat major in the verse to F major in the chorus. And I always love the way Brian modulates, because it doesn't seem like he's going, right, I need to change key here. It seems all very natural. And vocally, the Beach Boys are doing some really wild stuff, which is great. Lyrically, you can kind of get what vandykeparks is saying at some points, and then sometimes it's very metaphorical. But for me, I like that, you know. I think Cabin Essence is almost like the old world meeting the new world, you know, the frontier and all that kind of things. And it's a really interesting track.